God save the king. God save the king. Welcome to Occult Chronicles. Today, we're going to talk about something that has haunted the corridors of power since the dawn of civilization itself, an obsession so deep, so carefully guarded that it has survived the fall of empires, the rise of republics, and even the supposed enlightenment of the modern age. So let me ask you this. Where does this obsession with blood purity come from? Why do the world's most powerful families insist they descend from the same ancient gods? And more importantly, what are they really trying to preserve? Because here's what nobody wants to admit. This isn't a modern conspiracy theory. This is an ancient belief system that has been carefully maintained, adapted, and hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. And if you look closely enough, you'll see that the same symbols, the same claims, and the same families keep appearing throughout history, connected by an invisible thread that stretches back to the very first kings who walked the earth. Today, we're going to follow that thread. From the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the coronation ceremonies of European monarchs, we're going to trace the origins of the most powerful idea that has ever shaped human civilization, the idea that some humans are not quite human, that they carry the blood of gods. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll never look at royal weddings, political dynasties, or the symbols on currency the same way again. Let's start with something you can verify right now. Pick any major political dynasty, any royal family, any old money billionaire clan. Now look up their family tree. Go back far enough and you'll find something curious. They all trace their lineage back to nobility, and that nobility traces back to royalty, and that royalty, they claim descent from gods. The British royal family, they traced their line back to Woden, the Anglo-Saxon name for Odin. The Merovingian dynasty of France claimed descent from a sea creature mixing with the Trojans who fled to Europe. The Japanese imperial family claims unbroken descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. The Dalai Lamas are believed to be reincarnations of Avalokiteshvara, a divine being. Even the Rothschilds and Rockefellers, when you dig deep enough, connect to old European bloodlines that made the same ancient claims. This isn't coincidence. This is deliberate. This is genealogy as religion. Now you might be thinking, sure, but that's just ego. Rich people like to pretend they're special. And yes, that's partially true. But here's where it gets interesting. These families don't just claim divine ancestry for prestige. They behave as if they genuinely believe it. They marry within strict circles. They maintain elaborate records going back centuries. They use specific symbols that have remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. The eagle, the lion, the dragon, the serpent, the sun. Why would they do this if it was just theater? Why maintain this charade for generation after generation, long after the world stopped believing in the divine right of kings? Because to them, it's not theater. To them, this is science. This is the preservation of something they believe is real, a genetic legacy that traces back not to human origins, but to something older, something that walked the earth before modern humanity even existed. The elite don't just study history, they obsess over it. They fund archaeological digs in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley. They collect ancient texts and artifacts. They infiltrate academic institutions and control the narrative about human origins. And when you look at what they're searching for, you start to see a pattern. They're looking for proof. Proof that the old stories were true. Proof that they really do carry the blood of the gods. And the strangest part, The historical record actually supports their claims, not in the way they present it publicly, but in the way the ancient texts themselves describe it. Because when you go back to the beginning, to the very first civilizations that left written records, you find something remarkable. They all tell the same story, the story of when gods walked among men, when they ruled as kings, and when they mixed their blood with humanity to create a hybrid lineage designed to rule in their absence. This is where our investigation really begins. Not in the conspiracy theories of the internet age, but in the clay tablets of the oldest known civilization, in a place where history and mythology blend so seamlessly that even modern scholars can't tell where one ends and the other begins. We're going back to Sumer, to Mesopotamia, to the cradle of civilization itself, because that's where the bloodline begins. That's where the gods first chose their representatives on Earth, and that's where the obsession with preserving divine ancestry was born. Imagine you're an archaeologist in the 1900s, brushing dust off clay tablets in what is now Iraq. You're translating cuneiform script, one of humanity's oldest writing systems. And as you decode these ancient texts, you start to realize something unsettling. These aren't just myths. These are records, administrative documents, king lists, genealogies, and they're claiming something impossible. I'm talking about the Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating and controversial documents in archaeology. It's not a story, it's a list, a chronological record of every king who ruled in Sumer before and after a great flood. And here's where it gets weird. The first 8 kings on this list supposedly ruled for thousands of years, not hundreds, thousands. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alagar, ruled for 36,000 years. These weren't considered mythological figures by the Sumerians. They were documented as historical rulers, part of an unbroken chain of kingship that stretched back to when kingship descended from heaven. That phrase right there, when kingship descended from heaven, it appears over and over in Sumerian texts. The idea wasn't that humans developed leadership naturally. The idea was that leadership was a divine gift bestowed upon chosen individuals who carried their essence. Now, modern scholars dismiss these extreme lifespans as symbolic or mythological, but here's what they struggle to explain. Why would the Sumerians, who were meticulous record keepers, who invented mathematics and astronomy, who built the first cities and irrigation systems, suddenly become wildly fantastical when recording their own history? The Sumerians didn't see a distinction between history and mythology the way we do. To them, the gods were as real as the kings, and the kings were as real as the gods because they carried divine blood. This is where we meet the Anunnaki. Now, I know this term has been co-opted by every conspiracy theory on the internet, but let's look at what the actual texts say. The Anunnaki were described as a group of deities in Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology. The name literally means those of royal blood, or princely offspring. They were considered the children of Anu, the sky god, and Ki, the earth goddess. According to the texts, these beings came from the heavens and established civilization on earth. They taught humans agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and law. They built cities, and most importantly, they intermarried with humans to create a hybrid bloodline that could rule in their stead. This wasn't seen as metaphor. This was presented as genealogical fact. Enter Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous figure from this era. The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered one of humanity's oldest written stories. But Gilgamesh wasn't just a character in a myth. He was listed as the fifth king of Uruk in the Sumerian king list, and according to the texts, he was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. His mother was the goddess Ninsun, his father was a mortal king. Think about what that means. The Sumerians weren't claiming their king was chosen by the gods. They were claiming their king was a god, or at least part god, a hybrid designed to bridge the gap between the divine and the mortal. Gilgamesh's entire epic revolves around his struggle with mortality. He watches his friend Enkidu die and becomes obsessed with finding immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, who was granted eternal life by the gods. And when Gilgamesh fails to achieve immortality, he returns to Uruk and focuses on his legacy, the walls he built, the kingdom he ruled, the bloodline he would pass down. This is the prototype for every royal dynasty that would follow. The attempt to preserve divine essence through bloodline. The idea that power isn't just political, it's genetic. It's literally in the blood. Now here's where the story takes a turn that every ancient culture seems to remember: the flood. The Sumerian texts describe a great deluge that wiped out most of humanity. The reason? The gods decided that humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too troublesome. But one man, Zeus-Yudra in the Sumerian version, was warned by the god Enki to build a boat and preserve life. Sound familiar? It should, because this same story appears in Babylonian texts as the Epic of Atrophasis. It appears in Akkadian texts as the story of Utnapishtim. And yes, it appears in the Hebrew Bible as Noah's flood. But here's what most people miss. After the flood, the king list continues. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven again. New kings arose, but they no longer lived for thousands of years. The direct bloodline had been diluted. The connection to the gods had weakened. The Sumerian civilization eventually collapsed, absorbed by the Akkadians, then the Babylonians, then the Assyrians. But the idea that they created, the idea that kingship was divine inheritance, that certain bloodlines carried the essence of the gods, that idea didn't die. It migrated, it evolved. And it found its perfect expression in a kingdom that would dominate the ancient world for 3,000 years, a kingdom where the king wasn't just blessed by the gods, he was a god walking the earth in human form. We're going to Egypt. If Sumer was where the idea of divine kingship was born, Egypt was where it became religion, where it became law, where it became the very foundation of civilization itself. In Egypt, they didn't just claim the pharaoh was descended from gods. They claimed the pharaoh was a god, a living deity, the physical incarnation of Horus, maintaining cosmic order through his mere existence. This wasn't symbolic. This was genuine theological doctrine maintained with absolute conviction for over 3,000 years. Let me put that in perspective. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted longer than the time between the fall of Rome and today, longer than Christianity has existed. For 3,000 years, every single ruler of Egypt was considered divine, not chosen by God, not appointed by God, but literally, physically, a god incarnate. How do you maintain a system like that? Through ritual, through architecture that defies human capability, and most importantly, through bloodline control so strict it would horrify modern genetics. The pharaohs practiced systematic royal incest. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters. This wasn't about political alliance. This was about purity, about keeping the divine blood undiluted. Look at Tutankhamun. DNA analysis revealed he was the product of a brother-sister union. His father was Akhenaten, his mother was Akhenaten's sister, and Tut himself married his half-sister. This level of inbreeding had devastating consequences. Tutankhamun had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and likely died from complications related to genetic disorders. But here's the thing. They knew. The ancient Egyptians could see the physical problems that arose from these unions, and they did it anyway. Because to them, physical deformity was a small price to pay for maintaining divine essence. The pharaoh's body might be weak, but his blood was pure, and that blood carried something they believed was infinitely more important than physical health: the divine right to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, he was a cosmic necessity. Without him, without his divine blood performing the correct rituals, the entire universe would collapse into chaos. The Nile would stop flooding. The sun would stop rising. This is why the pharaoh's death was so traumatic. It wasn't just the loss of a leader, it was a cosmic crisis. The god had died, and until the new pharaoh was crowned, Egypt was in existential danger. The crowning ceremony itself was deeply esoteric. The new pharaoh would enter the temple as a man and emerge as Horus. He would receive the crook and flail, symbols of his role as shepherd and provider. He would receive the uraeus, the cobra on his crown. He would receive the false beard connecting him to Osiris, and most importantly, he would receive the 5 royal names, each one affirming his divine nature. The Horus name, the Nebti name, the Golden Horus name, the throne name connecting him to Ra, and the birth name, now preceded by Son of Ra. Every element reinforced one message: this person is not human anymore. The divine essence has entered him. He is God made flesh. But here's what reveals how these bloodline obsessions actually work. Despite all this rhetoric about divine blood, Egyptian succession wasn't always smooth. There were coups. There were entire dynasties founded by generals with no blood connection to previous pharaohs. So how did they maintain the fiction of divine bloodline? Simple. They married into it. The throne might be taken by force, but divine legitimacy could only be inherited through blood, specifically through the female line. While the pharaoh was Horus, the queen was often seen as the incarnation of Isis or Hathor. She carried the divine spark, and any king who wanted true legitimacy needed to mix his blood with hers. This is why royal women in Egypt had far more power than in almost any other ancient civilization. They weren't just consorts, they were vessels of divinity. And in some cases, like Hatshepsut or Cleopatra, they ruled as pharaohs themselves. Now, as Egyptian civilization declined, invaded by Persians, conquered by Alexander, absorbed into the Roman Empire, you might think this system would collapse. But it didn't. The idea was too powerful, too useful, too deeply embedded in human psychology. When the Romans conquered Egypt, they didn't abolish the pharaonic system, they adopted it. Roman emperors styled themselves as pharaohs when in Egypt, performing the ancient rituals, claiming the divine titles. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony both had relationships with Cleopatra, perhaps hoping to tie their bloodlines to the ancient divine legacy. And as Rome eventually fell, the idea of sacred bloodlines didn't disappear. It just transformed. The throne of the gods didn't vanish. It just moved from the Nile to the Tiber, from Rome to Constantinople, and eventually to the capitals of Europe. Because the royal families of Europe would soon make a claim so audacious that it would allow them to rule for centuries. They claimed descent from the same divine bloodline that produced the Pharaohs, the same bloodline that stretched back to Mesopotamia, the same bloodline that the gods themselves had created. And they had the genealogies to prove it. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because we're about to see how an ancient Near Eastern belief system somehow became the foundation for European monarchy, how the divine bloodlines of Mesopotamia and Egypt ended up being claimed by kings in Britain, France, Germany, and beyond. And the key to understanding this isn't found in history books, it's found in mythology, in the stories that royal families told about themselves. There's a medieval legend about a princess named Skoda, daughter of an Egyptian pharaoh, who supposedly fled Egypt and brought the Stone of Destiny to Ireland and Scotland. This same stone remains part of the British coronation ceremony to this day, housed beneath the coronation chair in Westminster Abbey. Is this story historical? Almost certainly not. But here's what matters. The royal families believed it. They claimed Egyptian descent. They claimed connection to the ancient pharaonic bloodline. Why? Because it gave them legitimacy. It said, our right to rule doesn't come from military conquest alone. It comes from blood that stretches back before Christianity, before Rome, all the way to the gods themselves. Every major European royal house had similar founding myths. The Romans claimed descent from Aeneas, a Trojan prince who was the son of Venus. When Troy fell, Aeneas fled to Italy and his descendants founded Rome. This myth was so important that Virgil wrote the entire Aeneid to establish it, creating a divine genealogy for Julius Caesar's family who claimed direct descent from Venus herself. The pattern repeated across Europe. The Britons claimed descent from Brutus of Troy. The Franks claimed descent from Francus, another Trojan prince. The Anglo-Saxon kings traced their lineage to Woden. The Scandinavian dynasties claimed descent from Odin and Freyr. Different names, different regions, but always the same core claim: divine ancestry. And always the same symbols. Look at European heraldry. Eagles, lions, dragons, serpents, the sun. These aren't random choices. These are the exact same symbols used by ancient Mesopotamians and Egyptians to represent divine authority. The Order of the Dragon, founded in 1408, was a real knightly organization whose members included Vlad II Dracul, whose name literally means Vlad the Dragon. His son would be known as Vlad III Dracula, son of the dragon. Why would a Christian order use the dragon as its symbol when Christianity portrays dragons as evil? Because the dragon didn't originally represent evil, it represented ancient power, royal bloodline, connection to forces older than Christianity itself. But here's what really seals this connection: the marriage patterns. Just like the Pharaohs, European royalty practiced strict endogamy. They married within their class, creating an increasingly interconnected web of bloodlines. By the 19th and 20th centuries, virtually every royal house in Europe was related to every other. Queen Victoria became known as the Grandmother of Europe because her children and grandchildren married into nearly every royal family. The result? When World War I broke out, the leaders of the three main warring powers, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and King George V of Britain, were all first cousins. They called each other by family nicknames. They were literally family, despite leading nations that were killing each other by the millions. Think about that. A family dispute that killed millions.
The Habsburg dynasty took endogamy to such extremes that Charles II of Spain, who died in 1700, was so inbred that modern genetic analysis shows his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings. He had a Habsburg jaw so pronounced he could barely eat. He was likely sterile. He died at 38 from complications that were almost certainly genetic. Why would they do this? Why risk genetic catastrophe for bloodline purity?
Even today, we see echoes of this obsession. When Edward VIII wanted to marry an American divorcee in 1936, he had to abdicate the throne. Why? Because the bloodline had to be protected. The British royal family's genealogy is one of the most meticulously documented in the world. They can trace their line back through William the Conqueror, back to the Anglo-Saxon kings, back to Woden. Every remaining European monarchy maintains similar records, but it's not just the monarchies. A 12-year-old girl once demonstrated that 42 of the first 43 U.S. presidents could be traced back to King John of England. And King John traces his line back through the very genealogies we've been discussing. These aren't coincidences. These are patterns maintained deliberately over centuries. Now let's talk about a phrase everyone knows, but few understand. Blue blood. We use it to mean aristocracy, but where does it come from? The traditional explanation is that it refers to Spanish nobility, whose pale skin showed their blue veins more clearly than the darker-skinned Moors. But this is almost certainly a later rationalization. In alchemical and esoteric texts that the nobility studied, blue blood represented celestial origin. The gods were said to have blood that was not red like human blood, but blue like the sky from which they came. Blue represented the heavenly realm. When European nobility used the term blue blood, they were claiming their blood traced back to the celestial, to the divine. So here we are at the end of our journey through time, from the clay tablets of ancient Sumer to the palaces of modern Europe. The bloodline that began in Mesopotamia, that was institutionalized in Egypt, that spread through Troy and Rome to Europe is still here, still concentrated in the same families, still jealously guarded, and still, according to those families, special, divine, superior. But let me leave you with something to think about. If blood is memory, whose memory are we preserving? Because there are two lineages running through human history. One is biological, names, dates, treaties, the visible tree. The other is conceptual, the myths that tell us who we are and who is allowed to rule. Dynasties can fall and still win if the story survives in our heads. Maybe that's the final secret. Maybe power doesn't need temples if people carry the temple inside them. Maybe the greatest ritual was never the crowning of a king, but the moment a civilization agreed that some lives were closer to heaven than others. So what do we do with a story that refuses to die? We name it. We see it. We stop mistaking inheritance for destiny. We recognize that divine right is only as strong as the memory we continue to feed it. And we ask a harder question, one the old families have asked for 1,000 years, but never for us. What do you remember? What truths are alive in your blood? Traumas, talents, loyalties you did not choose, but can still transform. If blood is memory, then memory can be healed, rewritten, redeemed.
The same current that bound kingdoms can free individuals. The same symbols that crowned empires can become mirrors, showing us not what we were told to be, but what we could become when we stop outsourcing our origin to the past. In the end, the guardians of old believed they protected a fragment of the divine. Perhaps they did. But here is the heresy their world fears most, that divinity was never a pedigree. It was a responsibility, and it does not end with them. When the procession ends and the lights go out, the question remains, quiet, patient, unforgiving. Will we keep remembering the story that kept us small? Or will we finally remember ourselves? This is Occult Chronicles. Until next time, question everything.